The motion for this debate is, this House believes that nations which refuse to include women athletes in their teams should be barred from participating in the Olympic Games. Without further ado, I invite the first speaker of the proposition to open the debate. Please welcome the doctor.
Ladies and gentlemen, when female athletes are banned from the Olympics despite their years of effort, when female athletes are systematically suppressed by the government for religious and political reasons, we believe that it is time for the Olympics to uphold its enshrined creed of peace, of friendship, and of progress. And that is why we stand proud in proposition. And as the first speaker, I'm going to present you with three substantive arguments. The first argument is that the nation's refusal is a blatant violation of Olympic principle. And secondly, is that sports is a perfect arena to empower women. And the third argument is that Olympics is an especially effective vehicle to promote women's rights in today's case. But and my second speaker is going to further tell you the positive impacts this policy will have upon a nation and upon different stakeholders. But before that, I would like to do several clarifications. So we think that the agent that carry out this policy should be IOC, the International Olympic Committee. And the nations we're talking about are nations wherein they are willing and able female athletes who cannot attend Olympic Games primarily because the nation's refusal to let them represent the nation. So now let's move on to my first argument about why this is a violation of Olympic principle and why the Olympic principle should be upheld in this case. So two layers of analysis. Firstly, we see that Olympic Games is never merely a sports meeting. It's never merely a sports event. We see that Olympic Games is also a platform that promotes the virtues that we cherish as the mankind. That's why in its creed we see that Olympic Games promotes the brotherhood of mankind. That's why Olympic Games promotes truth. That's why Olympic Games promotes the advancement of humanity. And we say that because of this kind of creed, Olympic Games is always a champion of inclusiveness, as we see both in the sense of gender and race. We raise you the example of Olympics admittance of women athletes way back in 1912. Even before the nations grant of female suffrage, right? So we believe that Olympic Games has always been a pioneer in terms of female equality, and that is why we believe that Olympic Games should always stand up for female equality in today's case. When the countries arbitrarily impose unequal standards criteria upon women, when the countries brief women with this kind of equal opportunity to compete in the game. And in the second layer, I will tell you why even as a sports event, Olympic Games should still the IOC should still carry out this policy. But before that, yes.
Also the House believes that your policy will harm whatever progress has been made by pioneers that you talk about, because now it seems that you need a quota in order for women to participate in the first place.
We are not saying that we need a quota. We're just saying that those women who are able should be granted this kind of chance to equally compete in the Olympic Games when they reach the bar. We're not saying that when they reach the bar, right? And now move on to the second argument. Why do we say that even as a sports event, the Olympic Games should still promote this kind of, should still carry out this policy. For what is the purpose of sports, ladies and gentlemen? We believe that the very nature of sports is to grant individuals with this chance to accomplish their maximum, to achieve their utmost values, and solely based on their own merits, right? We raised the example of Paralympic Games that were put in place since 1960s. We believe that Paralympic Games is a perfect example of how that we should allow, how sports should allow individuals to accomplish their maximum, to achieve their best, despite their natural disadvantages, despite their unfortunate birth lottery, right? So that is why we believe that there is a mandate for the IOC to uphold this kind of principles of sportsmanship and to allow the female athletes in those countries to achieve their maximum through participating in Olympic Games. Now, secondly, I will tell you why sports provides a perfect arena to empower women. So three layers of analysis. Firstly, as I've already told you, sports is always a champion of individual values, of individual accomplishment. And we think that it is especially important for women who are systematically suppressed in those countries to realize that they should have the opportunity to achieve their best, to get the chance to accomplish what they can do, right? And secondly, we think that sports promotes a new concept of beauty and virtue. We think that the reason why women were systematically suppressed in those nations was majorly because the imposition of social norm, the imposition of artificially created concept of beauty upon the women. That's described the women's sphere in households or in other fields. However, we see that sports promote another alternative that says that women can also be strong while being beautiful. It is still virtuous for women to compete with men, to be fierce and still be a virtuous and great human being. Now, thirdly, we argue that sports is always a platform to promote tolerance. We raised the example of Berlin Olympics, wherein the black athlete Owen was respected even by his opponents due to his accomplishment in sports, despite the epidemic racism at that time, right? So that is the reason we believe that sports provides a platform in which the people can respect the individual accomplishment of athletes, in which people can put away their intolerance and to simply appreciate the strive of individual athletes as human beings. Now, move on to third argument. Why do we think Olympic is an especially effective vehicle? Firstly, as we said, that Olympic Games has all the advantages of sports events that can empower women, and we think that it is actually the most prestigious sports event that can optimally accomplish the goal of promoting tolerance, that can actually accomplish the goal of sending women the message that can promoting an alternative view of beauty. And secondly, we see that IOC has always enjoyed this kind of credibility in the international community because of its moral high ground, because of its principle. So that is why we believe that the stance of IOC will actually be respected by the international community and will actually be appreciated by people around the globe as well. And based on all those reasons, we've told you why we need to uphold the principle of Olympic Games, why Olympic Games provides a great arena for us to empower women. And based on all this, we are proud to propose. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 22 seconds.
I think the first first proposition speaker for a speech. And now, to open the case for the opposition, please welcome Manoj Kumar.
Contrary to what proposition want to bring across, we think that the Olympics are a platform for the representation of culture, of a celebration of diversity and humanity as a whole, not just in terms of the sporting aspect. What we think then is that in status quo, women strive to change the societies within their nation, within patriarchal societies specifically, so that they can get the opportunity to compete within these competitions. What this means is that on the road to actually getting there competing, in nations, for example, such as Afghanistan, which have allowed women to compete in the recent times, what they are doing is that they are changing social dynamics within the nation just so that they can compete. Why is this necessarily better than what proposition are bringing across? We think that what proposition are bringing across is an artificial surface level change, where the international community asserts upon these patriarchal nations what should be necessarily the principle that they follow, meaning that there is no reason for any of these patriarchal societies to buy into the rhetoric that the international community is asserting upon them. So what we are going to tell you then is that this concept of forcing these nations to bring a tokenary woman to these competitions just so that they can compete is going to cause two main harms. The first is primarily to women, and that will be the premise of my case. The second is how it hurts sports in general, and that will be my second speaker, Sarah's case. Before I move into how this hurts women, a couple of responses to side proposition. Firstly, about promoting the brotherhood of mankind and that the Olympics should stand up for mankind. The first response is this: the Olympics are premised upon being culturally sacred. That is why we see situations such as people dressing up in their ethnic colors and bringing forth their own ideas towards these groups. What they are doing in their paradigm is essentially demonizing a certain specific aspect of the cultures of societies and rejecting that, and stating that the entry into these competitions requires them to reject any cultural perspective that they already had just so that they can participate in the competition. Why do we think this is particularly problematic? We think that the Olympics, unlike what they want to characterize, is a cultural event as well. The importance behind this cultural event is that it is a celebration of diverse groups of humanity on the simple level amongst humans, amongst far more commonplace individuals, where the whole of the world unites on this premise. But instead, it is being what they're bringing across is a divisive policy that separates those who do not want to participate who do not want to send in women. No, thank you, madam. Furthermore, we wish to point out that their case is premised primarily on these nations automatically sending in women the moment they are asked to by the international community. Why do we think this is not necessarily the case? Firstly, patriarchal societies have no reason to buy into this rhetoric. To them, this is an assertion that is unnecessary for them to accept. In fact, it rejects anything that they already hold dear to, meaning that instead of sending in teams, they would much rather pull out of the Olympics, because the Olympics in any case is just a sporting competition for them to compete with each other. It's a bonus to the societal structures that they already have, and it's not a necessity. On the second area of rebuttal, right, about accomplishing the maximum through the woman's ability. What we think is that the women will not be allowed to get away with the belief that they have done to the most of their ability. Instead, it will always be reminded to them that the only reason why they competed in the first place is because a bunch of men stated that they should come for the competition before the nation can compete. Meaning that you're not actually going to be recognizing the ability of these women. In fact, you're only going to recognize them as a presence that unlocks your ability to compete within the Olympics. Before I continue, yes, sir.
We're not artificially elevating the women's qualification, right? We say that women were already qualified. The only reason they were not in was because of the imposition of the state.
Why do you think this is a false characterization? Firstly, within these patriarchal societies, we question whether women are even allowed to train in the first place, whether they are even allowed to build up themselves. Even if they do, forcing them into these competitions is only on the premise that so that other men can compete in this competition as well. Why do we think that this is tokenary in its nature? We think that women are essentially being viewed as a tool to compete in the Olympics, rather than allowing them to compete as a platform for representing themselves. The final and most simple area of contention, promoting concepts of beauty. This relies primarily on the notion that these groups will suddenly accept this. Why is this not true? We don't think that there's any reason for patriarchal societies to adjust to these social norms and accept them. But now let us move on into the substantive material today from side opposition. No, thank you, sir. Why the feminist movement is discredited is the first level of analysis. Firstly, we want to tell you that you're feeding into the rhetoric that women can only be part of the same platform as men when it is required of them, when there is a specific directive policy that forces them to be part of it before a further end goal can be accomplished. In this case, women are needed to unlock the process of getting into the Olympics. The problem behind this is that what previously happened, as you already characterized, is that feminists had to fight for themselves and to develop cultures and develop notions of acceptance within the nation before they can actually progress onto this global international stage. Instead, this movement is being regressed when it is stated that whatever push that they are fighting for is not necessarily important, because we can always arbitrarily, no thank you sir, we can always arbitrarily assert that women should be part of it, and this magically solves the problem of women not being respected in their scenario. Why do you think that women still won't be respected even if their policy is brought across? No thank you sir. Because women are essentially viewed in the process as means to an end, that they are unnecessary, that they are merely used just to get to the competition. More than that, feminists lose a platform for them to compete and voice out their own perspectives. Previously, this area of sports was one of deep contention within these societies that allowed women to rally and unite themselves onto this one perspective that they want to compete in terms of these competitions. No thank you sir. What this causes then is that it removes a platform for feminists to unite these fractured groups within these patriarchal societies, meaning that overall, women are weakened in terms of how they can be united in the already very few limited options within this nation. On to the second level, why do we think that women will be demonized further? No thank you sir. How? We don't think that not every nation will see to the desire of the international community. When specific parts of culture are targeted and resented, nations have no incentive to participate within the Olympic Games. The effect then is that men who, when the nations pull out of these competitions, men will essentially view these women as the cause of their downfall. That they cannot participate in these competitions primarily because of these women. These women are hence essentially prevented from allowing themselves to garner any respect, because men are even more actively and intensively working against them to constantly remind the rest of society that the only reason why they cannot compete on an international platform is because of these women. What we think then is that this is where we have a counterfactual to their dynamic, where it is not true that they are inherently all going to participate in the Olympics, but it is instead true that these groups of people will pull out and blame women for it, further worsening the situation for the lives of women within the nation. On the final level of how this hurts women, right? We think that what the Olympic villages allow these competitors to do is to have some level of cultural appropriation to discuss how they each accept women in their own unique ways. What Proposition's policy does is negate the need for patriarchal societies to learn about this aspect of respecting women, where they no longer need to learn about how they can respect women further, because in their mind, they've already crossed the threshold of respect, where the very minimum is set to them as sending women for competitions, rather than integrating them into society. So this platform for learning through these Olympic villages is essentially being cut away. What we see then is that women in the long run are being helped in no way by side proposition, and hence we are very proud to oppose.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 6 seconds.
The first opposition speaker for his speech, and now to continue the case for the proposition, please welcome our counsel.
Ladies and gentlemen, basically there are only two things that the opposition side tells about, right? First thing is that Olympic is a cultural-centric thing that you should not intervene with other countries' culture, and all cultures are intrinsically equal. Second thing that they talk about is that why there will be backlash in those countries that who choose not to send female athletes. Let's rebut them one by one. The first argument is that Olympic should be culture neutral, right? Ladies and gentlemen, we don't believe that the concept of gender equality is something as neutral. We see that the gender inequality should be upheld by each and every culture, right? We give you an example. If that's the case, if Olympic is truly culture-centric, then we believe that the Nazism should actually go into the Olympic, because this is also a form of culture in itself. So there are sole arguments on why the culture itself is not the sole justification on why it should enter the Olympic Games. Ladies and gentlemen, we see that we should value whether the culture itself fits the spirit of sport, right? And we also tell you that we should value whether the culture itself fits the spirit of Olympics. And we believe that sometimes even Olympics will even change certain rules to adapt some culture that has already accepted equality, right? We give you an example of a runner in South Africa who does not have full legs, and when he runs, the IOC just allows him to attend the next Olympic. So let's move on to the second rebuttal on why the woman is not will be harmed by our policy, right? Their basic idea is that the society itself is too conservative that it will not allow anything to happen on our paradigm. Their justification is that, you see, on our paradigm, women is used by a tool. So, but we ask you to read the motion again. The motion said that this house believes that the states who refuse to accept a female athlete. So we believe that the underlying assumption of this motion is that there are women athletes who want to go to the Olympic Games, but it is the state itself that is actively rejecting those women athletes. We believe this is a fundamental assumption of the motion. And we see that proves why it is that the state rejecting the women from achieving their freedom instead of the women being used by the state as a tool. So even if the women are used by the state as a tool, we see that is even better in our paradigm, because we see that people will see how the culture in the patriarchal society has already started to have some image of change, right? And we believe that the people in that country will also see the change from happening. But let's move on to the second argument on why there will be a backlash, because men athletes will hate women, right? First of all, we believe that this is exactly a punishment that we have against those men athletes, because we believe that the state is enforcing a wrong policy. We give you a similar example in all economic sanctions, right? Economic sanctions are directed to the people, but we believe that this is a justified means for the United Nations to use economic sanctions against authoritarian states. So let's move on to my arguments on why those countries will have the incentive to change. But before that, let me spend a little time further on the idea of men athletes in those countries, right? We give you first rebuttal on why this is a justified punishment. The second rebuttal is that why this phenomenon itself will help the country to change, right? First of all, we tell you that First of all, we tell you that athletes actually can move between countries. For example, China ping pong players come to Singapore to play after they retire, right? We tell you that athletes, when those men athletes are rejected from participating in their country, the other countries will actively asking them to ask them to immigrate in the other country and compete. And in that case, this is further disencourage the country from practicing their wrong policy again. Well, we see that the country will see their good athletes are driven away by their wrong policy. Yes.
Deal with the analysis that these nations will believe that they've already crossed the minimum threshold for needing to respect these women, that there's no need to do any more, and that whatever cultural appropriation you are talking about does not happen to be in your paradigm and is mutually exclusive to ours.
Okay, I'll explain why the country has not realized that there's a minimum threshold to respect gender equality in my second argument on why the country will have the initiative to change. First of all, we tell you that we analyze the characteristics of this country. Is that this country most of them are Arabic countries, and we see that most of them can actually produce huge amount of oil, meaning that those countries are very powerful and those countries are economically very strong. The result for that is that no other means that we now find in the international community is very effective in terms of forcing them to change their human rights conditions, right? Because we see that if you use economic sanctions, they will use the tool of OPEC to fight against you. And we see that the developed countries, even as the United States, do not have the power to change the human rights conditions and gender equality issues in Saudi Arabia. That's the reason why we believe that we should use a more appropriate appropriate tool to change the situation happening in Arabic nations. And we see that the best tool to do that is the IOC. We already told you what IOC is a very
Due to the analysis that organic change is already happening and we don't need the international community to try and force their way.
We don't think that change is already happening. We see that Arabic country doesn't even allow women to drive, right? We see that the fundamental rights of the women are not respected at all in Arabic nations. So let's continue to this. Why it will have a positive effect on all women in those Arabic nations. We believe that it will create exposure for women, right? We see that in those Arabic nations, the idea is that the women cannot be shown that too much. And we see if that's the case, if the countries start to send athletic groups to Olympics, the country will realize that there are women representing their country as their role model. And if that's the case, we see it will incentivize people to realize why women is also an indispensable part of their nation. And the mild majority will finally begin to realize why women is so important in our nation, and finally find some traces of women in their major news reports, in their major televisions, right? That's why we believe that it is a very good tool to change this. And further than that, we also tell you why the sport itself is in principle a good tool. We see that the reason why sports can promote tolerance is that sports has a common ground for all mankind can participate. The similar analogy we draw from space exploration. We see that in space exploration, mankind aim for the same goal, and we see that in space exploration is one of the only area where human beings can cooperate and establish the international space station, right? So we tell you that the reason why that we propose this motion is not only because we are fighting for the women, but also because that sports is the best tool and Olympics is the best tool to fight for gender equality. We are very proud to propose.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 13 seconds.
I thank the second proposition speaker for a speech. And now, to continue the case for the opposition, please welcome Sarah Tin.
Ladies and gentlemen, the wheels of change are already in motion. We see a world that is increasingly accepting towards women and is increasingly allowing women to compete in sports. This then begs the question of why proposition insists on forcing their way through international law in order to force these countries to change overnight. We think that change cannot be overnight because these kinds of change are not sustainable, these kinds of change are not true, real change on the ground. And we argue that instead we should wait and be patient for organic change to take place. I have two main rebuttals to what they've said so far. Firstly, on the idea of the justification that somehow the Olympics is all accepting and inclusive and that's why we should allow women in. Or rather, we should not allow countries to ban women. Secondly, on how we can help or harm women. So on the first issue, on whether or not it's justified for the Olympics to force countries to field women, Now, this is where we deal with the whole idea of that they've come up to us and told us about Olympics being something for shared humanity, something that we have to be all-inclusive about. Ladies and gentlemen, being accepting and being all-inclusive of cultures doesn't mean that you force your culture on another person. It doesn't mean that you say that their culture, where they inherently undermine women, is something that we cannot accept. We admit that these kinds of cultures have to be changed. We admit that there's something wrong with it. But we don't think that you can outright say that that is wrong, because that will only further antagonize them and drive them to the extreme. What we instead think is that the Olympics is something where you accept cultures, you accept that they used to have patriarchal systems, and you slowly but surely encourage them to change it by allowing them to participate in competitions like the Olympics, where there are so many women athletes, where there are so many other cultures that have successful women athletes. Something that Manoj talked about in his point on cultural appropriation, no thank you, where competitors can interact through sports, interact in things like the Olympic villages to understand other cultures without you forcing it on them. So this is where we completely reject the analysis given to us by side proposition. But let's move on from there. They then talk about how we have to change and how they want to help women by giving them the opportunities they never got. Ladies and gentlemen, we're not just talking about women who are able to compete but are not allowed by their countries. We're talking about women who don't even have an opportunity to start competing, who don't even have an opportunity to train. They tell us that the motion rejects this because the underlying assumption of the motion, no thank you, is that women are able to compete and they're just simply barred from it by their countries. But we see that on the first level, this is not true, because many countries that don't field women athletes in the Olympics are because they don't even have women athletes who are competing and sufficiently qualified. But secondly, even if we accept that's true, we don't think this solves the root problem on their side that they want to solve. The problem that women are not given opportunities, because either way, in their paradigm, countries who don't even give training opportunities to women to start on a sporting career still don't have to do anything about it. So we don't see how their paradigm solves anything, how their policy changes the situation. Then they talk to us in their second speaker about how a lot of these countries are Arabic countries who have economic might, and that's why other policies such as economic sanctions don't work. On the first level, we don't think these policies are needed in the first place because we have really talked about organic change. We have, for instance, places like Afghanistan where women are slowly able to start having sports. We talked about how women in Afghanistan are able to field boxers in the Olympics, in the London 2012 Olympics, something that we think is an incredible achievement that we can solely accredit to feminist movements and the will of the women in Afghanistan as a whole, rather than these kinds of policies that they want to bring up today. But on a second level, we also think that these economic sanctions necessarily work, even if we want to do it, because these Arabic countries are still dependent on the first world for oil and things like that. So we completely reject their analysis. But let's move on to my substantives for today. I'll be talking firstly about the kind of Western rhetoric that they are propagating through such a policy, and secondly, how we harm fledgling nations who are just starting to compete in sports. On the first idea, on how we propagate Western rhetoric. Before that, yes.
If there is truly an organization, that means that people are usually moderate and can really accept this kind of Western rhetoric already.
So, just because there's organic change doesn't mean that people are suddenly moderate. It's not like it's a binary thing where you're either radical and patriarchal or you're moderate and liberal, right? We don't think that it's necessarily divided like this. We think that there's a spectrum that you're slowly inching across, but by having your policy, you undermine any progress that you have made, despite how small this progress might have been. But let's move back to my point on the idea of Western rhetoric being propagated. The thesis for this point is that by imposing these kinds of policies that they want to impose on female athletes, you polarize the Western and Islamic world and buying into anti-Western rhetoric. Why is this so? Because we think that Olympics is something that is associated a lot to the Western world. We understand that the Olympics is internationalized, and we understand that it accepts all cultures. But the fact is that it was started in Athens, and it's something that Western countries have been dominating and have been and their presence has been very strong in the Olympics. What does this mean? This means that when you prevent countries who don't want to send female athletes from competing, which we assume is the punishment that they're going to give on their side if you don't abide by their policies, right? This means that in the end, these countries will continue the kind of anti-Western rhetoric that has been slowly gaining momentum in Islamic countries. We're talking about countries that might, for instance, say, oh, they don't accept our culture, they don't agree with us, but we think we're right anyway, so we just think that they're trying to bully their way through us, and they're trying to force their agenda through on this level, and they don't want us to compete with them. We think that this is inherently problematic because it polarizes the Islamic world and the Western world. And we think that this further escalates the kind of tensions rather than bringing together an international community that is accepting and is inclusive, which is something that we admit both sides want to achieve at the end of the day. So ultimately, we think that this is a harm that harms Western communities, harms Western rhetoric, and it harms the kind of relations between Islamic and Western nations. Let's move on to the second point on how we harm fledgling nations. The thesis for this point is that countries that are slowly, finally able to send even any athletes at all to the Olympics are now being barred simply because they cannot abide by such policies that they want to send. We're talking about countries, for instance, like Oman, and countries like Saudi Arabia, who don't even have very large contingents in the Olympics in the first place. And we think that when it's a struggle for them to even send male athletes to the Olympics, that requiring them to send some kind of female contingent or imposing a value judgment on them being unable to send female contingents is inherently harmful to the kind of sporting infrastructure and sporting culture that you want to propagate in these countries. We admit that sport is a good that is nice to have and we want to encourage in countries, but when you have such a policy that increases the barriers of entry into sport for people, we think that this ultimately disincentivizes sports from becoming a popular culture. We think that this ultimately undermines these countries who won't even be able to stand on their feet, who won't even be able to compete. At the end of the day, what have we shown you today? We've shown you that organic change is slowly but surely happening, and we need to be patient for this change to occur. We've shown you how feminist movements have been fighting so hard, which is why you have successes in places like Afghanistan, in places like Saudi Arabia, where women are allowed to drive as of 2005. So we've shown you that how organic change is something that's happening, but on their side, they're just going to undermine it. On their side, their bullying tactics and policy is just going to force the way through to a world that is not accepting of women. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 10 seconds.
Thank the second opposition speaker for his speech, and now to continue the case for the proposition, please welcome Lee Sigang.
Two questions today. Firstly, whether the idea and the spirit of Olympics is consistent or inconsistent with the idea of banning women from attending Olympics. And secondly, what are the tangible effects on women and whether our policy will work. So the first idea, basically the opposition side has been too simplistic, right? They were basically saying that Olympic Games is a cultural affair where everybody wearing cultural clothes in order to show the so-called diversity. But the thing that they have ignored is that we have established from our very first speech that the underlying premise and the underlying ground of Olympics is that all of us competing in the Olympics should share a common ground. We should all be regarded as equal human beings. And it is only on top of that we actually accept diversity, right? That we think that diversity does not make sense when the ground of equality, when the ground of having a common ground to compete as equal individual is destroyed by their side. Why is that so? We've given you the example of Nazis and they never respond. But let's give you more examples, right? So for example, if a country wants to separate white people from black people, is the IOC still going to permit them on the ground that is somewhat a kind of kind of a diversified ideology, a kind of diversified culture? We say that obviously not, right? We say that there are certain basic grounds that the Olympic Games holds, on top of which you can build anything else that they mentioned, like diversity or like the spirit of competing, etc. But then on the third speaker, they were actually kind of like they conceded a bit to say that, oh, you know what? If you want equality, let them interact, like right, let the men athletes to interact with women athletes from other countries so that they know that the world is changing. The thing is that the thing that they forget about this is that why don't you just directly let the women athletes to expose them, right? Because ultimately this is a more direct exposure that shows that the country itself is actively embracing this idea. And then they assume that once you let them interact, things are going to change. We think that we let those countries send male athletes for decades, right? But things haven't changed at all. So we see that this is not a viable alternative. But then on the second issue, right? Then on the second issue, what are the tangible effects on women? They've always been talking about organic change and organic change. So our first challenge is, if organic change is so low, why are so many countries still not sending women? And the only argument on that is that, well, somehow the men athletes being sacrificed in this process, they're going to hate the women furthermore. So two assumptions here. Right? Firstly, they assume that the government's response will always be to just refuse to send more women athletes, and I'll deal with this part later. But then further, in the third speech, they actually conceded, right? They say that in those countries normally they don't have a lot of men athletes after all, right? So if they don't have a lot of men athletes, we think that the hatred problem is rather undermined. But then come to probably the most important problem. Right? What would be the response of those countries? What would be the response of the states? They continuously accuse us of states not having an interest or not having a motivation to do so. We say this is not true. Why is that so? We say that Olympic Games is never just about sport. It's more about showing and asserting your political power in the international arena. Why is that so? We actually give you the example of China. Right? China spends so many money in organizing the Beijing Olympic, and also like the major powers in the world who are economically very strong, they also spend a lot of money training and preparing the athletes for this Olympic sports. Why is that so? Because this is also a place where different countries show their national power. And furthermore, we think that people ultimately want to see the country being represented in this kind of game. Why? It shows that it shows the people a kind of a sense of belonging, right? They feel that the collective identity being represented when the athletes are on the sport. So the solution left to the government is that we're sending a clear signal to everybody in the world. You either take our solution offer to send the woman, or you lose a great chance to assert your political power, or you upset everybody in your nation to not seeing the country being represented, right? So we think that actually under this kind of psychology, we feel that we actually push more pressure on the ruling power to concede to our policy. Why is that so? Because we tell you that at this point everybody knows that if we're still not going to have women representing us, if we're still not going to see our athletes representing our country, it's all the fault of our government, because they can simply take that choice. But in reality, they do not, right? So we think that this is a motivation that actually pushes the government to take this choice. And then secondly, they say that about men being sacrificed or so on and so forth, right? So I feel that firstly, we don't see that the reaction of country or the reaction of the state will always be to refusing to send women even under this condition. But then even if it's so, right, we feel that the men being sacrificed, it's a necessary part of this, right? We compared it with the model of sanction, where maybe civilians are going to suffer a bit more in any economic sanction. But the ultimate and the better and higher goal is that we expect the dictators to be pressured by these sanctions so that they make a change, so they make the change and the long-term change in the country, right? And this is the same scenario here. We expect this to pressure the national leaders to actually make a change that will benefit the women in the long term. Yeah.
economic sanctions happen because of the actions of governments, whereas in your case, these kinds of policies happen because women are unable to participate.
Yeah.
So the resentment goes.
I know, I agree. So next problem, I'm exactly going to talk about this, right? But whether it's really true that women are just enabled to do so, right? So I feel that even if women are enabled, it's not because women themselves they're not willing to do so, or that they're not talented enough. It's only because the government has been systematically suppressing their opportunities, right? So I feel that we're actually breaking this vicious cycle where the government does not have a motivation to offer them more opportunities, where the woman does not have a motivation to actually prepare themselves and train so hard, because ultimately they're not going to have a chance to participate in the most prestigious game in the world, right? So I feel that this is a systematic problem that outside the house is going to solve by breaking this vicious cycle. But then they came up with the argument of feminist movement being seen as weak. But we see that feminist movement ultimately is something that is a cause that is international, right? It does not mean that other countries or international communities helping the feminist movement within a certain country does not make the feminist organizations in this certain country seems weak and unable. We think that it's a fair means and a means that is used everywhere for empowering women. And then let's come to the final issue about why Olympics, right? So the third speaker come up with a new argument about Western dominance, about how this will fit the anti-Western rhetoric. So we think that this could not be so. This will not be so, right? Because I've already told you that now the people in those countries they see that they have a choice, right? They have a choice to break this cycle. They have a choice to see the athletes being represented. They have a choice to see the women being treated properly. So it's not that they're going to turn to be anti-Western. They're going to see how the clear sign. They're going to see how the government could have done to make a big change, but the bloody government just refused to do so. So we think that rhetoric is against the side of government rather than what they say so. So based on this, we're proud to propose.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 26 seconds.
I thank the third proposition speaker for his speech. And now, to continue the case for the opposition, please welcome Jonathan Wu.
Ladies and gentlemen, side proposition would like to have you believe in today's debate that side opposition doesn't care about females, we don't care about their rights. Ladies and gentlemen, we care about the women in the world when we want to further the rights of the women living in Arabic states, in the women living under oppression, just as we don't think that their model is necessarily the right way to go. More importantly, they would also like you to have you believe that there's no change happening in countries like Saudi Arabia. There's no change happening in countries like Iran. Ladies and gentlemen, we think that is technically false. Why? Because we think that over the past decade, there has been changes that are happening in Saudi Arabia, changes that have been happening in Iran, right? We see that in 2008, Saudi Arabia passed a law for women to drive, right? We see that in 2010, Iran passed a law that allowed regulations to the hijab, whereby women were allowed to reveal more of their legs and more of their head, right? We also see that in UAE, women are allowed to work in different sectors they otherwise would not have been allowed to work 10 years ago. As the third speaker for side opposition to today's debate, I'll ask two questions. Firstly, who best further the rights of females? And secondly, is the Olympic Games necessarily a good vehicle for social change? On my first question, who best further the rights of females? I'll look at this through two worlds, right? Their world and our world.
on their world, we think that their world lacks one of nuance, where they do not see the idea of culture and the necessary need for organic change, right? They fail to realize that in countries like Saudi Arabia, whereby the people there are devout Islam Muslims, right? We see that in those places whereby they pray 5 times a day and whereby they adhere very strictly to the Quran and to the cleansed states of the readings of the Prophet Muhammad. We see that in those places we cannot force anything on them, because we see that in those countries the culture and their identity is so ingrained in them, right? That the only way that we can make change, allow change to occur, and the only way that we can allow females to gain more rights is by taking a more measured approach, is to slowly but surely improve the system. Not something they would like you to believe, not something they will propose, right? Their policy, which they have none in today's debate, whether it's a quota or no quota, or whether I just allow one female to go, will be taken in its best form by some opposition in today, right? Their whole policy lies on the premise of credibility. We don't think credibility is necessarily a good premise on their side of the case. Why? Because we don't think that the credibility of the IOC will necessarily be able to reach its target audience. And the target audience that we're talking about today is that the Islamic states, the Arabic states, right? We think that all their policy does is to alienize these Islamic Arabic states, and all that happens at the end of the day under their paradigm is that these Islamic states, as Marsh has already spoken of in his speech, will not go for the Olympics in the first place, right? We think that that is a nuance that they have lacked to understand in today's debate. We think that that is seriously harmful to today's debate. More importantly, even if we agree with them that their credibility does work, we think that the conformity point that they brought to you in today's debate is not necessarily good on 3 levels. Firstly, we think that what happens is that it creates a glass ceiling for feminists and for female athletes in those countries, right? What happens is that we think that countries like Saudi Arabia, countries like Iran, will only send 1 or 2 female athletes, right? Just so that they can break the mark to enter the Olympics. We think that that is necessarily harmful for their side of the house. Why? Because they're over extended periods of time. We don't think that there will be a real female contingent that is going. Just a tokenary sum that is just to allow the male athletes to go. We think that's necessarily harmful, and we don't think that should stand. More importantly, on the second level, we think that what their side does is that it creates a placebo effect, whereby people think that, oh, females are able to go for the Olympics, so there shouldn't be a problem in the country anymore. And on that level, we should not be able to, we will not want to further the rights further, right? Yes, sir.
We don't see how this will incentivize the feminist movement whose main goal is actually a political one, economic one, rather than an Olympic one.
So I get your point. But what we're trying to bring forward to you in today's debate is the idea whereby once you allow people to go, but you place an artificial cap on the number of women that go, it creates a reality whereby people suddenly think that the rights of the women have been furthered, when at the end of the day, they are not, right? So we think that what the feminist movement may proceed in other areas, we think that the areas such as sports, the areas such as lifestyle will necessarily be left out in your paradigm. More importantly, more important on the third level, let's look at who their policy really touches and who their policy really reaches in today's debate. No, thank you. We don't think that their policy will necessarily reach the average woman in today's debate. We don't think that their policy will be able to reach the average Saudi Arabic athlete that they're talking about. More often than not, we see what happens is that the only people that are able to take part in the Olympics are people who are related to the royal family, right? We see that happening in the 2008 Olympics, whereby King Abdullah sent his niece as a representative of the Saudi Arabia team, right? And all she took part in was the horse riding thing. And we think that that's problematic. We think that is problematic because what happens is that there's no change, and that the average Saudi athlete is not able to be affected, right? All that happens is that the people that currently already have more rights than the average person just has a further improved in their social standing, right? We don't think that they have understand that point, and we think that has come to haunt them. But on the third area, whereby their world has a logical fallacy, and that's where they bring the idea of exodus, right? Whereby female athletes will suddenly leave their country to head to the bright sunny island of Singapore, right? We think that that example that they've given us is more of a misnomer. Why? Because we don't think that under their paradigm, female athletes are even given the ability to practice on an Olympic level, right? So we don't think that these nations that actively suppress women, actively do not allow women to enter sports, will necessarily care whether their female athletes leave the country or not. On our side of the house, we are showing you two things. We are showing you how a mixture is good, whereby male athletes can integrate with other athletes from around the world, allowing them to go back to their country and make a difference. We have also shown you on our side of the house why their policy demonizes women, whereby the only reason why they are allowed to go for Olympics is because the men allow them to. Both ideas they've never dealt with in this debate. This brings nicely to my second question, which is the Olympics a good vehicle for social change? We already told you through Manoj and Sarah that the Olympics is more of acceptance of culture, and it's more of breeding friendship, not as a tool, a politicization tool that they would like you to believe, right? Something that they have likened to an economic sanction. We think that is very bad, especially when Sarah's point says about Western rhetoric, right? Something they never dealt with, whereby clerics and imams are able to use this and preach to the people, whereby the Western imperialists are suppressing their ideas onto us and trying to change our culture, and they should be stopped. More importantly, within the bigger picture in today's debate, it's about feminism, not the ideas of the Olympics. Because we think at the end of the day, you can uphold all the ideas of the Olympics, but if you do not, as a whole, as an aggregate, further the rights of feminism, allow women in such states whereby they're currently being oppressed to gain a higher social standing, we think that their side of the house false. Because at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, side opposition furthers the rights of women. Because at the end of the day, we believe that women should gain a higher social standing in society. We deserve to take to this debate. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 51 seconds.
I thank the third opposition speaker for his speech. We will now move to the team's 4-minute concluding reply speeches. To deliver the opposition's reply speech, please welcome Manoj.
Throughout the opposition bench today, we have constantly rejected the proposition's false characterization that just because you institute this policy, every Arabic state is going to send in people and that this is magically going to improve the situation for women's rights within these nations. What opposition has fought for is the long-term development of feminist movements in terms of respecting them and developing cultures within these nations which are not just based on this artificial level of sending women in, but are instead premised upon changing social structures within the nation to actually accept these women as part of their society and as one of them to compete, not just being sent in as a tool to gain access to the Olympics. There are two key areas in which opposition takes this debate. Firstly, why this policy hurts women and why it doesn't benefit women in any way. We started off very simply when we told you that there is a false threshold for women's rights being established. This idea was never contended with side proposition, where they only stated that they are not creating a false threshold. But the logic behind it is sustaining, right? Where we tell you that the only logic that we are bringing across, or the basic logic that we are bringing across, is that this is viewed as the minimum amount of respect that they need to give to women, and as long as they give it, they can be part of the international community's stand for women's rights. We pointed out how this is a false characterization, that this is not necessarily the case regarding the wider movement of respect towards women. But more than that, we pointed out to you why the IOC is not supposed to be a tool for hammering in Western ideals into these nations. We told you how this idea of sport is one of acceptance of culture, where across all speakers we defended this idea that culture is meant to be diverse and adjusted to one another, and that this representation of culture is why people use the Olympic platform in the first place. But in their paradigm, it is instead a political tool to prevent certain nations from presenting their own beliefs and their own ideals, and it's instead used to change them and to hurt their cultures and ideals. On the second level, right, we pointed out how dictators do not have this rational decision-making calculus, that they won't necessarily send them in immediately just because their policy institutes. We told you how why dictators do not have an incentive, because they view sports as just a peripheral issue. We pointed out the main harms of this in terms of a spectrum of countries. when they do accept their policy, women are viewed as a tool. But more importantly, when they deny their policy, right, there's increased anti-Western rhetoric. Instead of accepting the Westerners as one of them, instead they are viewed as excluding these individuals, excluding these specific states from the arena of sports. And more than that, women are demonized as the creatures who are preventing men from competing on an international arena, meaning that women are hurt as a whole by their policy, regardless of whether or not they're being accepted or denied. On the second level, right, on why they are causing a damage to culture, we think what the IOC is doing, unlike what their rhetoric wants to bring across to you, is demonizing specific targeted aspects of culture within these nations. Aspects of culture that these individuals attach themselves to and fundamentally understand as part of their way of life. When they're only allowed to compete on an international platform, when they let go of their way of life, what these people think is that the Olympic platform is no longer about representing themselves, or is no longer a platform for them to show themselves as competitors and as one humanity, as both sides want to bring it across today. Instead, it is about homogenizing everyone. We think that the fundamental of being one humanity is having diverse cultures and respecting them, where you have different groups of people and you celebrate these cultures, not by forcing every single nation to align itself with Western ideals. On the second level, we pointed out how you're stagnating cultural development towards the respect of women's rights, an idea that was never contended with from side proposition. When we told you how this platform of sports was a key area for competition within these nations, where feminist movements use this as a platform to rally people and to unite them for their cause. What we are bringing across to you then is simple. Side proposition's policy only hurts the ability of women to be respected and prevents them from ever being respected in the long run.
Speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 4 seconds.
And now, to conclude the case for the proposition and the debate as a whole, please welcome Wahauser.
Ladies and gentlemen, two contentions in this debate. The first contention is on the spirit of Olympic Games and on the spirit of sports. The second contention is on which side further improves women's rights movement, right? So on the first idea of Olympics, we tell you that the side opposition is continually telling you that Olympics game is a place where you should accept every single culture, right? Even if the culture by its very nature is discriminative against certain social groups. And we contend that idea by telling you why the spirit of Olympic Games is not only for just tolerance, but we should tolerance based on the universal respect for women's rights. And we also tell you why the idea of gender equality should be respected by each and every culture. And we believe that that is more true than just saying that just using the culture itself as a justification for allowing every country to enter into the Olympic Games, which we seem have a higher goal. But second thing they tell us about only in their reply speech is that why we actually politicize the Olympic Games. We tell you this is not true. First of all, they never tell us what is the idea of politicization. Second of all, we also told you why politicization could be used for a higher goal, right? We tell you the idea of why sports promotes toleration, and we tell you why sports will help people to understand each other because now they have a common ground to compete, right? So we believe, and on the principle of Olympic Games, on the principle of sports, we took this debate. But further than that, we also tell you why our side furthers the feminism movement, right? Their side is basically running a very defensive case. They're telling you that we can just wait and see because they tell us that all organic changes will happen very naturally. First, we already told the first idea coming from their side is accusing us of demonizing the women. And we already told you that they are contradicting themselves because the only thing that they said is that we see male athletes will be unhappy, right? But we already told you that they told you themselves that the only man that the Arabic nation sent is a man riding horses. Only one man athlete, and he will have such a the large impact on the rest of the nation, right? And we also tell you why it will not demonize the women, right? Because we told you that the people's nation pride is higher than that of the hate against the women. We tell you why people want to see their countries represented. And we also prove to you why this need to see itself represented in the international arena is higher than the domestic hatred between two groups, right? And they also give the idea of minimum threshold, accusing us of presenting a fake picture of gender equality. But ladies and gentlemen, we already told you that our goal is not to let the international society realize that Arabic nations are doing something, but our real goal focuses on the women inside the Arabic nations. We see that Arabic women, what we really care is about how women inside Arabic nations will get represented, and they will ask for more rights, and they will get the exposure, right? And they finally retreat to the idea of polarization, right? They tell us why the Western nations will be further polarized against Arabic nations. We already told you that is untrue. We told you that how America sold dozens of fighters to Arabic nations. But we also told you that this kind of polarization will not happen because we told you that the spirit of Olympics and the nature of sports will be the tolerance, and the sport will lead to understanding. So, in conclusion, we told you why the spirit of Olympic and sports stand on our side. We also tell you why we will protect the women's rights by sending athletes, and we increase exposure for all women in Arabic nations. We're extremely proud to propose.
Speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 20 seconds.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this debate. Please wait in the area outside the room or the adjudicators to deliberate on the verdict. We'll call you back into the room when the adjudicators are ready to give their judgment.
Round pretty soon, and one of these two teams has to be getting on and prepping for that round within the next few minutes. So I'll tell you the very basics behind what happened. We'll then go down to the lecture theatre, get ready for the next round, and teams can talk to the judges for a bit of more detailed background if they would like it. There were many good things about this debate. There were a number of interesting arguments raised. There was good clash and good engagement between the teams. A few quite sophisticated ideas coming up. But one thing the judges felt really was lacking somewhat on both sides was a really clear explanation of the philosophical underpinnings of the team's case. There were two basically major philosophical ideas clashing against each other in this debate. The first was the idea of female equality, that all societies should recognize the right for women to have equality in various spheres, both sports and other areas. The second was the whole idea of cultural diversity and cultural inclusiveness, accepting that not every culture is going to be exactly the same as each other, and embracing rather than condemning countries for being able and allowing them to have those cultural differences. Both of those are the sort of things where if you throw them out to the average reasonable person by themselves, without weighing them up against each other, the average person will reasonably say, well, yeah, that's, I suppose, a reasonable concept. Neither team then fully, really clearly explained to us why they felt that particular principle that they were advocating was one that we should believe in, beyond just sort of throwing out and assuming that because as reasonable human beings we should agree with it, and also really weighed it up against the other team's principles. So there could have been a lot more development of the philosophical underpinnings of the arguments, but because neither team did that, or either really compared them, what this debate ended coming down to was a debate about the practicalities of this particular policy and which one is just likely to work and produce a slightly better result, noting that there were pros and cons to both. So we would like to see a little bit more philosophical discussion, but that isn't what we got. We have to weigh up what we did have. So what were the sort of practical implications that did come up here? Firstly, the whole idea of which is going to bring about change for women and women's rights in sports, in society, even the way that society views women generally. That was an interesting thing that came up early on in the debate. the whole idea of, how do people view women? Are they, in terms of, can they be viewed as sports people? Can they be viewed as something different from the traditional conception of women as the weaker sex and the more beautiful sex? Interesting idea that came up early on. It kind of died, but the other aspects, particularly of general social role of women, did continue to play out as the debate went on. We had arguments about which side is going to do the best to encourage feminist movements in certain countries, to continue to build and push change. We had the whole idea of, is the Olympics the right platform to push this kind of change in society? Or are there other better ways to do it, keeping it out of the sporting arena, looking at sanctions and other areas instead? And we had the whole idea of, is this just going to end up being counterproductive because the nations we're trying to target will just choose to stay out of the Olympic Games, and therefore, in fact, we might see regression rather than progress in terms of sports in general, and particularly sports for women in those countries. Those were the ideas that went backwards and forwards between the teams over the course of the debate. There were some good arguments raised, but we did in the end, as a unanimous decision, all three judges agree that one team by the end of the debate had done a better job of nailing down all of those practical aspects and showing that the way that they conceived it probably was going to bring about more of a result, and therefore the winning team is the opposition.